Hey everybody, Ridgely here from Harding Shymanski. Very excited to have with us Senior Executive Consultant John Key. And we're going to talk about a very important topic, which is the credit crunch. And so to kick us off, John, what is the credit crunch?
The credit crunch, quite simply, has several different factors to it. The credit crunch is involved around the tightening of credit standards that's applied by financial institutions when there's a reason, which is going on right now with the rising interest rates. The rising interest rates that have been going up, we've had 11 or 12 increases in a relatively short period of time since early 22, moving into today, have caused banks and financial institutions to take a look at the lending standards to protect against any defaults and to slow down the availability of credit, which essentially helps do the job for the Fed in controlling inflation.
And how does that impact business and the consumer?
That's a great question. It does affect both. Number one, you have to take a look at the interest rates and what's happened with inflation. Increasing interest rates. We were practically at zero interest rates in March of 2022 following the pandemic. Zero. Since that time, we've had 11, 12 increases. Fed fund rates are 5.25. Prime rates jumped up to 8%. That drives pressure on the ability to repay. So if you're a business or you're a consumer, you need to take a look at that and say, I'm paying more. I'm going to slow down what I consume, which that ties back to what the Fed's wanting to do is slow down the overheating of the economy, get everything slowed back down so they can pull the rates back down. And it's been a little bit stubborn over this period of time, but it affects the consumer, it affects the business, increased cost, and because of the credit crunch, and I'll call it a mild credit crunch. This is not a deep credit crunch, but it's tightening. And you'll hear them refer to tightening. And they're tightening the standards. They're making it a little more difficult to get a mortgage loan, a little more difficult to get a car loan, a little more difficult to get a line of credit for business operations, a little more difficult to extend term on term debt for commercial. So it impacts both consumer and commercial, and it's done on purpose to slow down the economy.
Talk to us a little bit about the recent failures of a number of financial institutions like First Republic, Signature Bank, Silicon Valley Bank. What does that impact? How does that affect what do we learn from that? What do other institutions need to do?
Relative to credit crunch, those are isolated incidents. Those three that you mentioned are specialty banks of tremendous size. The three banks that failed, one bank that was assisted, are three of the four largest bank failures in the history of the financial system. So it put a big strain. It caused a lot of talk. It caused a lot of chatter, what's going on. But those businesses don't do what the other, let's call it 8,000 banks do. And that's loan money to businesses, loan money to consumers, take deposits, make loans. They don't look anything like that. They were in specialty businesses. They were loaning to hedge funds, loaning to startups, loaning to technology, and there's more risk in that. And as that risk was amplified by the increasing interest rates, the cost became too great, and that caused those banks to fail. The other thing that's on the portfolios of all banks that everyone's wrestling with just a little bit is the interest rates on your loans plus the interest rates you're earning on your bonds in your investment portfolio. The rates in the portfolios are very low in the banks, and they're starting to come up. They're starting to inch up as loans mature. So those were liquidity issues that are not widespread through the system. Now, I'm not going to say there are not going to be other bank failures. There could be, because there's some balance sheets that are pretty stressed, but not a widespread what we saw 15 years ago, Ridgely, with the banking crisis. That's not there. Banks are much more well capitalized by requirement. They're highly regulated, and there's more liquidity in the system today than there was then to absorb something like this.
Well, that's good. Now let's talk about a little bit about what can you do if you're a business or a consumer facing this credit crunch. What would you recommend?
Well, they always say cash is king, and I always laugh. because they said, well, if I had cash, I wouldn't need to borrow the money. And I understand that, but you want to be as liquid as you can be, both as a consumer and as a business. So you want to make sure when you go in and you know it's going to be a tightening standard, what they're going to be looking for, if you're a consumer, stable long-term employment, net worth, equity in your home, your debt to income ratios are in line, usually 35–40% of your gross income. Get all those things, make sure those are in line where they need to be, that separates you. The credit crunch essentially on consumer affects more leverage transactions, 100% lending, high loan to income or income to debt ratios. Those are where it's crunched and slowed down. You keep your ratios in line with what I just talked about on a consumer, you're going to be able to acquire credit, but it's going to be more expensive. So if you can and when you can, it's a good time to utilize cash to lower what you're borrowing. So I may have borrowed on a $10,000 loan. Maybe I say, typically I would have borrowed $8,000. Well, if you can borrow $7,000 or $6,000 with interest rates up around 8, 9, 10%, it's better utilization of your cash, which was not as important when interest rates were practically zero. For businesses, same thing. Your operating lines of credit, make sure that you have your receivables, make sure you have your inventory levels at elevated levels, that you have good coverage, that you can show the banks and financial institutions that you have good coverage. Keep good, strong equity in all of your equipment. Don't highly leverage any of your transactions, and keep a reasonable amount of cash in there. As I call it, a rainy day fund. I always used to advise my commercial clients to make sure that you kept a substantial amount of cash. And when I say substantial, can you operate the company without leverage for 6 months by using your own cash? That makes you more flexible. And it doesn't hold true for every industry. Every industry looks a little bit different. But on consumers, I would say you keep 6 months of operating cash locked away, save it when you can, and don't dip into it. And then you can go through some of these hiccups that you're going to have with inflation in the economy if you have a little extra liquidity.
Final question for you. How long do you think this slightly different credit crunch is going to last?
Oh boy, I wish I could say. It does look a lot different. The dynamics of this have played out different than anything I've seen in my 40-year career. I don't think it's going to go a long time further. I think it's going to be more of what we used to call a soft landing. Everybody talks about soft landing. I think we can achieve that. I think you're seeing numbers now. The inflation is slowing down. The bank results that have been coming out this quarter, about 50% of them have exceeded Wall Street estimates. About 35% have not met Wall Street estimates. About 15% have been on. That's good news to me. That means that most of the banks are managing through the process. The other thing that is positive, as I mentioned earlier, the more duration burn off you have in the loan portfolios and the bond portfolios. In other words, as bonds mature and as loans mature, they reprice at higher rates. Not necessarily always good for the consumer, but it'll drive us out of this recession, inflation battle and get us back to more normalized activity. You know, one thing I might add, the reason it's so unusual originally, any period of time, but just take a look at 10 years before 2022, the previous 10 years. Inflation never was over 2.4% in a given year and was as low as 0.1. So is that realistic? Are we playing catch up? There could be a little bit of that going on. We really haven't dealt with those low of rates in this dynamic economy for so long. So there's a little catch up being played right now. And you see it in my mind by the fact that the labor market has stayed in a position where it really isn't full. You're still getting people wanting to go to work, even though you've had a lot of layoffs. So, you know, it's a really unusual thing. I think if you really press me on that, I think the economy probably will look much improved in the first quarter of 25. And I think you'll see kind of a slow recovery through 24.
John Key, Senior Executive Consultant with Harding Shymanski. Thank you very much for valuable information and advice for both business and consumers. Thanks, John.